Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, paradigm-shifting interpretation of biblical eschatology. We're going to explore the ideas of David Chilton, specifically his preterist perspective on the passing of heaven and earth. Now, if you've ever read the vivid, highly apocalyptic language of the Bible and just wondered how on earth to make sense of it all, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to break down these complex theological concepts step by step to make them crystal clear and honestly, incredibly captivating. So let's just dive right in. All right, to kick things off, let me ask you kind of a weird question. What actually happens when the stars fall? To get at this, David Chilton once recounted this highly entertaining letter he actually wrote to the TV evangelist Jack Van Impe. Now, Van Impe was pretty famous for his literal, dispensational interpretations of end-times prophecy. So Chilton is watching Van Impe's show one day and decides to ask a question that perfectly highlights the bizarre paradoxes you run into when you take a strictly literal view of the apocalypse. He pointed to these really intense passages in Matthew and Revelation. You know, the ones where they describe the sun turning black, the moon becoming like blood, and the actual stars of heaven literally falling onto the earth. And this brilliantly illustrates the core problem Chilton was trying to point out. He posed this logical riddle. In Revelation, after the stars fall, the kings and mighty men hide themselves in the dens and rocks of the mountains, right? They're begging the rocks to fall on them to hide them. But Chilton asked, wait a minute, if the entire Milky Way galaxy has just collapsed onto the Earth, what rocks are even left? I mean, really, if the universe has exploded and completely evaporated, how can anyone be left to hide? And in what mountains would they possibly be hiding? This logical absurdity sets up the central mystery of our explainer today. Did the biblical authors really mean physical gravel, rocks, and outer space matter? So here's our roadmap for how we're going to untangle this theological puzzle today. First, we'll decode apocalyptic language. Second, we'll look at metaphors of the cosmos. Third, the first century last days. Fourth, the transition period of the Old Covenant. And finally, a new heaven and earth. Okay, starting with part one. The end of the world, decoding apocalyptic language. So how exactly does Chilton solve this massive puzzle of a collapsing universe? Well, he argues for a complete paradigm shift in how we read these ancient texts. When the Bible speaks of the passing of heaven and earth, he argues it's almost never referring to literal space, gravel, sand, rock, or physical planets. Instead, it's actually a prophetic idiom. In the language of the ancient prophets, heaven and earth was a well-known metaphor for the religious and political state of Israel and the Old Covenant temple system. So when you're reading about the universe collapsing, it's not physical destruction at all. It's the dissolution and destruction of that specific Old Covenant world order. Moving right along to Section 2, Metaphors of the Cosmos, and the historical backing for this idiom. Now, what's really fascinating here is that this metaphorical lens isn't just some clever modern invention. It actually has deep historical roots. Take the 17th century Puritan scholar John Owen, for example. He noted that when God took the children of Israel out of Egypt and formed them into a church and state at the Red Sea, he symbolically planted the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. Therefore, Owen argues, when the destruction of that specific state or government is mentioned later on, it's naturally described using language that sounds exactly like the end of the physical world. It's like a giant linguistic puzzle, where all the pieces actually fit once you know the code. And this brings us to an absolutely crucial redefinition of a word found in the book of 2 Peter, where it says the elements will melt with fervent heat. Now, a modern reader sees the word elements and immediately thinks, the periodic table, physical atoms, chemistry, the actual building blocks of matter. But Chilton points out that the Greek word used here, stoicheia, is used elsewhere by Paul in Galatians, Colossians, and Hebrews to refer entirely to the fundamental principles or rituals of the Old Covenant sacrificial system. So Peter isn't talking about nuclear fission here. He's talking about the melting away of those ancient Jewish ceremonial laws. Let's jump to Section 3, the first century, last days, and the urgency of the epistles. If we trace the chronological flow of the New Testament, you immediately notice a tone of intense imminence. Around AD 30, Christ prophesies the destruction of the temple. Then, fast forward to the mid-60s AD, and writers like Peter and Jude are essentially dropping everything to warn their readers of an imminent, absolute emergency. Jude even abandoned writing a systematic theology just to warn of an apostasy happening right then. Chilton argues that the last days were literally happening right there in the first century. They were the last days of the Old Covenant universe, culminating in AD 70 with the literal, historical destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Peter tells his first century readers to look for and hasten this day. And honestly, why would he command them to look for something that wouldn't happen for thousands of years?
Now, sure, some argue that because a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, words like soon or shortly might actually mean thousands of years in our human timeline. But Chilton draws on J. Stuart Russell's really powerful counterargument. Russell states that treating the Bible's explicit notes of time arbitrarily, so that soon secretly means late and near really means distant, is actually an assault on God's veracity. To suggest God promises something speedily but actually means millennia later implies God has two weights and measures. As Russell so bluntly puts it, interpreting language this way is worse than unreasonable. It's immoral, because it completely undermines the faithfulness and truthfulness of God's promises to that original first-century audience.
This brings us to Section 4, Obsolete, the Old Covenant, focusing on the transition period. To really understand the stakes of this debate, we need to look at how this impacts the view of biblical law today. The source material outlines the perspective of Greg Bahnsen, who is a prominent figure in theonomy. Bahnsen's argument generally divides Old Testament law into two categories, moral and ceremonial. He notes Jesus' words that not a single jot or tittle of the law will pass away until heaven and earth pass away. Now, because Bahnsen believes the literal physical heaven and earth are still here today, he argues the moral laws must still be entirely binding right now. However, he also asserts that the ceremonial system, like the animal sacrifices and temple rituals, has already become obsolete because of Christ's work on the cross. But this is exactly where Chilton pushes back on the grammar, noting a fascinating distinction in the text. Bahnsen summarizes the book of Hebrews by saying the ceremonial system has become obsolete, meaning past tense, but Chilton points out that the actual Greek text of Hebrews 8:13, which was written before the fall of Jerusalem, says the Old Covenant is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. It's a continuous present tense transition. Chilton argues you really can't say every little jot and tittle remains until the physical universe ends, while simultaneously claiming the ceremonial parts have already ended. Instead, Chilton posits that heaven and earth passing away was precisely that transition phase. The Old Covenant was actively passing away, but it wasn't entirely gone until the temple physically fell in AD 70. And finally, Section 5, A New Heaven and Earth and the Gospel Triumph. So this naturally leads us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? If the old world, meaning the old covenant system of Israel, passed away in AD 70, what is the new? We so often just assume the new heavens and new earth is the eternal afterlife or some pristine future physical reality. But what does it actually look like when we view it through this preterist lens? Well, Chilton turns back to Isaiah 65, which happens to be the exact passage the Apostle Peter references when he looks forward to the new heavens and earth. And if you sit down and read Isaiah 65, the characteristics of this new creation are incredibly revealing. It describes a period where normal human life just continues. People are building houses, they're planting vineyards, they're aging, and they're giving birth to children. And as Chilton rightly points out, people aren't exactly going to be giving birth and dying in the eternal state of the afterlife. Therefore, this new creation cannot be a literal floating space station or the eternal afterlife. Instead, it is the ongoing era of the Christian church. It's a period of gospel triumph, where daily human life absolutely continues, but it does so under a completely new, permanent spiritual order and a new covenant. And that brilliantly brings us to our final thought for today. Are we misreading ancient prophetic symbolism through the lens of modern literalism? By forcing our 21st century scientifically literal minds onto the highly poetic, covenantal language of first-century writers, are we completely missing the profound transition that already occurred? Because understanding heaven and earth as a covenantal system rather than the Milky Way galaxy, well, it completely reshapes how we read these ancient texts, doesn't it? It challenges us to read the Bible on its own ancient terms. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this has sparked your curiosity and given you a brand new framework to think about.